This is calm thinking for people who feel stuck in the system. This is quiet million, the penny that told the truth. There's a jar on your counter or in your car or stuffed in a drawer somewhere. Pennies, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. I knew they weren't worth anything, but I still didn't throw them away. That contradiction, knowing they're worthless but refusing to get rid of them, is worth paying attention to. Because it's not irrational, it's a signal. Your behavior is telling you something your thinking hasn't caught up to yet. Because what just happened to the penny isn't a minor policy story about a coin. It's a clean, datable example of what happens when a currency system debases its own unit, and then, 43 years later, admits it can't even afford the replacement. In February of 2025, President Trump ordered the U.S. Mint to stop producing pennies. The stated reason was cost. In 2024, it cost 3.69 cents to make a 1-cent coin. The Mint produced 3.2 billion of them and lost $85.3 million doing it. The 19th consecutive year that production costs had exceeded the coin's actual face value. 19 consecutive years. Not a rounding error. Not a temporary supply problem. A 2-decade-long acknowledgement, buried in annual reports, that the system had already broken at its smallest unit and just kept going anyway. But the cost problem didn't start in 2025. It started in 1982. I remember hearing about this years ago, that it cost more to make a penny than the penny was worth. I remember dismissing it the way you dismiss a lot of broken system facts. One of those things that's technically true but doesn't matter, because the system just keeps running anyway. But then I thought about the bubblegum machines. I remember when those machines took pennies. Now I don't even see those machines anymore. The smallest denomination any machine will even take is a quarter. The system had already adjusted. I just never noticed when. That's when it hit me. The system had already moved on without announcing it, without asking permission. And I've been living inside that adjustment the whole time, without ever seeing it. In 1982, the U.S. Mint changed what a penny was actually made of. Before that year, a penny was 95% copper, solid, dense, warm to the touch. The kind of metal that's held value across every civilization that ever used it. After 1982, a penny became 97.5% zinc with a thin copper coating, a zinc disc wearing a copper mask. It looks the same, it spends the same, it costs less to make, and it contains almost none of the metal that gave the original coin its worth. The reason was straightforward. Copper had gotten expensive. The commodity inflation of the 1970s had pushed metal prices broadly higher, and by the early 1980s, the copper inside a penny was worth more than the coin itself. So instead of letting the money system absorb that cost honestly, the government quietly swapped out the material. The coin stayed the same on the outside. The substance changed on the inside. This is what ancient wisdom calls debasement. The prophet Isaiah described it this way: your silver has become dross. Dross is the waste material, the cheaper filler mixed in when a metal is stretched further than it should go. Isaiah wasn't writing about coins. He was writing about a civilization losing its integrity. But the metaphor has held for 2,700 years because the mechanism never actually changes. The 1982 penny is a modern dross coin. Not silver, not copper, zinc, dressed up to look like something it isn't. By 2006, the copper inside a pre-1982 penny was worth more than a penny. The metal had appreciated while the face value stayed frozen. The Mint's response wasn't to acknowledge that the original coin held real value. The response was to make melting it illegal. In December of 2006, new regulations made it a federal offense to melt pennies or nickels, with fines up to $10,000 and up to 5 years in prison. Think about what that regulation actually says. It says, the metal in this coin is worth more than the coin, and we're making it illegal for you to access that value. The government, by making melting a crime, basically confirmed the thesis. You don't make something illegal unless it's worth doing. The copper was real. The face value was fiction. By 2024, it cost 3.69 cents to produce a coin worth 1 cent. Copper prices had pushed past $5.50 a pound and kept climbing. The penny, the zinc one, the already debased one, had become so expensive to produce that even the cheaper substitute couldn't hold the line anymore. I was actually angry when I learned all this, not at the policy, at myself. Because I had deposited over $100 in loose change at the bank just a few months earlier. I didn't sort it, didn't check the dates. Just dumped it all into the machine and took my receipt. And the only thought I had afterward was, how many pre-1982 pennies did I just hand back without even looking? That was the moment it stopped being abstract. That was the moment I understood I'd been living inside this system the whole time without seeing it. So they stopped making pennies. Here's the part most people miss. There are still pre-1982 copper pennies out there in circulation. Not many. They've been slowly disappearing for decades, pulled out by collectors, lost, worn down, deposited without sorting. But they're still out there. And with penny production now halted, the supply of all pennies is permanently closing. Pre-1982 copper pennies are, at this point, a finite and shrinking resource. The mint isn't going to make more. The copper in them, 95% pure, 3.11 grams a coin, doesn't degrade, it doesn't inflate away. It's the same copper it was in 1975, or 1962, or 1943. At current copper prices, a pre-1982 penny contains roughly 2.5 cents worth of metal. That's 150% premium over face value, just sitting in a jar, or a sock drawer, or a roll from the bank. Storing them is completely legal. Congress specifically declined to ban hoarding when they wrote the melting ban, noting that a prohibition like that would be nearly impossible to enforce, and that ordinary citizens might end up breaking the rule without even knowing it. You can collect as many as you want. You just can't melt them. And you don't need to melt them for them to serve a purpose. There's one more pressure on that supply worth knowing about. When Canada ended its own penny in 2012, the government melted most of the coins that came back in. The U.S. Treasury has that same legal authority here. If a recall ever happens, the pre-1982 copper pennies people deposit without sorting are simply gone. The window for finding them at face value closes quietly, the way most of these things do. This is the same logic behind what's called junk silver. In 1965, the government did to dimes and quarters exactly what it did to pennies in 1982. Pulled the real metal out and replaced it with something cheaper. Before 1965, a dime was 90% silver. After 1965, it was copper nickel clad. The silver disappeared from circulation almost immediately because people recognized the difference between a coin that contained something and a coin that merely represented something. Pre-1965 coins became known as junk silver, not because they're worthless, but because they're ordinary, circulated coins, whose value comes from the metal, not from rarity or condition. Nobody holds junk silver to melt it down next week. They hold it because it's a recognized form of metal, with a known composition and a face value floor underneath it. The worst case is that it spends as money. The better case is that the metal inside is worth more than the number stamped on the front. Pre-1982 pennies are basically the third tier of that same system. There's a verse in Matthew that records Jesus sending his disciples out with a specific instruction about money. He lists exactly what not to carry: gold, silver, or copper. 3 tiers, 3 metals, a hierarchy that most of the world recognized for most of human history. Gold for large transactions and reserves, silver for everyday commerce, copper for the smallest, most ordinary exchanges, the kind that actually reach regular people. The penny before 1982 was copper money in that original sense. It had weight. It had substance. It was the lowest tier of a real system. What replaced it in 1982 wasn't copper money. It was a symbol, a zinc token that looks like a coin and functions like a coin, but contains no meaningful store of value. A placeholder. A receipt for 1 cent, backed only by the government's willingness to honor it. Ancient societies understood that when rulers started substituting base metals into their coinage, it was a signal, not necessarily of conspiracy, but of pressure. The system was being stretched. The substance was being hollowed out. Isaiah's silver become dross line wasn't a moral complaint about metallurgy. It was an observation about what happens to institutions when they stop valuing what they claim to value. The penny's death in 2025 is that same observation made into a news story. This isn't an argument to panic. It's an argument to notice. The pre-1982 copper penny is one of the lowest barrier entry points into alternative metal infrastructure that exists anywhere. You don't need a brokerage account. You don't need to understand futures markets. You don't need to spend money you don't already have. You just need to go to a bank, ask for rolls of pennies, and sort them by date. Anything before 1983 is copper. Anything 1983 and after is zinc. The copper ones weigh 3.11 grams. The zinc ones weigh 2.5 grams. If you have a small postal scale, you can sort them without even reading the date. The copper ones make a distinct ring when you drop them. The zinc ones sound like a dull thud. That's the entire system. Copper on one side, zinc on the other. For the copper ones, you're holding metal at face value. The floor is 1 cent. It's still legal tender. The ceiling moves with copper prices, which have been rising structurally for a decade now, driven by electrification, AI infrastructure, and tightening global supply. Copper is currently trading around $5.60 a pound, more than double what it was back when the mint first ran into trouble in 2006. Then consider what happened in 2025. The Trump administration declared copper a national security concern, launched a federal investigation into America's dependence on foreign copper, and ultimately imposed a 50% tariff on copper imports that July. That sequence is worth tracing slowly. The same government that quietly stripped copper out of your pocket change in 1982 because it had gotten too valuable is now treating copper as a strategic asset worth protecting with tariffs and federal investigations. That's not irony, that's the confession. The metal they removed from circulation is now the metal they're scrambling to secure, and you can still find it in bank rolls for 1 cent apiece. This isn't investment advice, and it isn't a price prediction. It's an observation with a 1 cent entry point, a way to hold something real. The education comes free with the coin. The system did something in 1982 that most people never noticed. It changed what money was made of, not dramatically, not with a press conference, just quietly, efficiently, because the incentives pushed in that direction and nothing pushed back. It spent the next 40 years manufacturing the replacement at a loss, only admitting the problem once it became impossible to ignore. Then it stopped. If you've got a jar of pennies somewhere, you might want to sort through them before they disappear entirely. The copper ones aren't going to make you rich, but they are going to stay copper. That's more than most things can promise. If you want to follow this as it develops, you can find it at quietmillion.com. No urgency. Just the next observation when it's ready.